I rise to set out Labour's position on the New Zealand Productivity Commission Bill. Labour will be supporting this bill, despite concerns about the potential for it to adopt a narrow view of productivity and to move in a direction different to that of the cited precedent in the Australian Productivity Commission. Mr. Speaker, there are two versions of productivity that lie behind this debate. The first, Mr. Speaker, is a view of productivity that is broad and deep and includes all of skills, technology and capital, and the ways in which they contribute to growing output per labour hour. Mr. Speaker, there is another way, a short-term way, that people can contribute to output per labour hour, and that is simply by reducing the supply of labour, to cut costs and to sweat the assets harder in the short term and to result in higher output per input, but to mortgage the future to pay for the present. Labour clearly stands for the former vision, a deeper, richer version of productivity, and a mandate for the Productivity Commission, which gives it the breadth and scope to responsibly address those factors as it must and should. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to commend the work of the Select Committee by moderating the terms of reference, the purposes and objectives of the Commission. It has brought it somewhat closer to the Australian model than the original draft introduced by the Government. And, sir, it is on that basis that Labour is prepared to support this bill through the House and to support the establishment of the Commission, but it is also that we will do so with a clear reservation, and that is that we would have preferred to see in those terms of reference a more explicit mandate for economic and industry development, such as occurs in the Australian case. We hope, however, nonetheless, that the cooperation between the Australian and New Zealand Commissions will be deep, and that the broad mandate of the Australian Commission will be reflected in practice in the way that the New Zealand Commission discharges its responsibilities. Mr. Speaker, the Select Committee has, and I'm very well aware, Madam, of the changes the Select Committee's made, and if you would withstand yourself, you will hear me say that the Select Committee has made this a better bill by giving the Commission a broader mandate and amending the functions of the Commission to remove the previous dominant focus on investigating the impact of regulation. This should not be a regulatory razor gang. We already have a regulatory impact analysis unit and a regulatory responsibility process, and it is interesting that the Government has observed that in the breach, with less than half of the bills going through in the last year having fulfilled its own criteria for regulatory responsibility. So the Labor Party, frankly, does not need a lecture from the government benches about regulatory responsibility, because this party in government had a far stronger record of regulatory impact analysis than that government has proposed. And the last thing New Zealand needs is yet another razor gang pretending that deregulation is a substitute for sound economic development, or that sweating assets is a substitute for real productivity. And, Mr. Speaker, it is our hope that that will not be the case, that under the new chair of the Commission, the new Commissioner, Mr. Sherwin, Dr. Sherwin, a high-profile, an able public servant, but it must be said not necessarily the person that we would have first looked to be the founding Commissioner. But, sir, we will work with the new Commissioner, and we will look forward to see him chart a course to the future. So this is important work. New Zealand is lagging behind many OECD countries in terms of its productivity growth. Indeed, it was ranked only 22nd out of 30 in terms of economy-wide productivity. And after a period of relatively strong productivity growth since the mid-1980s, where productivity growth cycles average between 2.5% and 2.9%. It began to taper off and averaged only around 1 to 1.5% since 2000. The policy areas that could contribute, therefore, to raising New Zealand's productivity include increasing incentives for investment, and appropriate investment, sir, in business growth, not in bidding up each other's property prices. And a Productivity Commission, I believe, is going to have to deal with the incentives that are in our investment environment that are misdirecting capital flows to areas that do not raise skills, do not enhance tools, do not improve output, but instead simply increase the costs of housing and building. And that, sir, is not productivity. Stimulating innovation. Innovation is the engine room of productivity. It is the lifeblood of progress. Staying ahead of our competitors and enjoying the benefits of sustainable competitive advantage through intellectual property has got to be what gives New Zealand the edge, what builds on our fine natural resources, and what brings home the bacon of a first world income with which we can build a first world society. But innovation requires investment, and it requires systems that take a bright idea to a commercialisable development that can then reach global scale and be marketed to the world. Building New Zealand's skill base. It's too often the workers themselves who are forgotten in a debate about productivity, like they are somehow an input cost or a commodity. And yet the most successful companies, sir, are the ones that involve their workers in building the best possible processes to create their products and services, that eliminate waste, that think of smarter ways of doing things, that share the profits. Those are the most innovative and productive companies, sir, and that's what we'd like to see more of. And of course, this all rests on a sound macroeconomic and fiscal environment. We could go, as we have in the previous bill, sir, into debates about whether such an environment exists today, and I can do no better than to point to Standard & Poor's verdict that the current government is on negative watch, no doubt, as a result of several rounds of irresponsible tax cuts that the country could not afford. The Australian Productivity Commission, sir, provides a useful benchmark for how we can take that debate forward. It's played an incredibly valuable role, sir, in our view, in providing independent review, analysis and comment on policies and structures in all of the states and territories of the Commonwealth. And on top of that, sir, looking at the impact of reforms, their work assists their government to benchmark their performance against other jurisdictions within the Commonwealth and identify ways of doing better. It, I think is fair to say, does have a reputation for excellence, and that comes in part from its independence. The Australian Productivity Commission is, of course, also well-resourced with upwards of $30 million per annum, and it attracts high-quality analysts and researchers. For such a commission to work well here, it will also have to have adequate capacity and funding. And there may be some question as to whether there is a depth of talent here to staff up such a body, or whether some of that talent will need to be brought in from overseas. National has found some funding for the Productivity Commission within existing departmental baselines, and the Labour opposition will be monitoring whether that is sufficient to fulfil its mandate, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me summarise and close. Mr. Speaker, Labour is supporting this bill through all stages, having benefited from the discussions in the Select Committee that improved this bill and broadened its mandate and purpose. But, Mr. Speaker, we do so with vigilance, and we do so with a warning. The warning is that this must not become a regulatory razor gang. The path to productivity is not paved on deregulation, but on investment in skills, technology and capital. And it is charting that pathway and developing our industries, providing sustainable growth in our economy, that is the role, function and mandate at the heart of this bill.